on May 19, 1940 as the first German tanks near the coast. General Maxime Weygand takes over as head of the French armed forces, succeeding Generalissimo Maurice Gamelin, whose plan and strategy have just been severely defeated. The arrival of the respected and energetic Weygand, with a coherent and credible plan, restores hope to the French army, which was previously short on solutions and gloomy. The Battle of France is far from over, and the French army, carried by a new breath, is going to do nothing less than try to repeat its miracle from the Marne of World War I. Discover the remarkable tale of the Weygand line, whose many tactical triumphs were later emulated by American and NATO forces. What situation does Weygand find when he takes office? Well, it is nothing short of catastrophic. By May 20th, before his initial orders took effect, the Germans had reached the English Channel coast. The Belgian, British armies, and the best elements of the French army are thus trapped in the north of France as well as in Belgium, allowing the German army to gradually tighten its grip and reduce the pocket. Meanwhile, the final orders from Gamelin, the removed commander-in-chief, and General Georges, the Northeast Front commander before Weygand, are significant. Both felt, each on their own, that it was essential to reconstitute a front south of the breakthrough, as well as trying to mount a counteroffensive to separate the head of the breakthrough from the rest of the German army. Contrary to popular belief, Weygand does not cancel any of his predecessors' instructions. However, he lands in the midst of a situation that is chaotic and confusing and must quite logically take hold of it and understand what is really happening on the ground in order to be able to restore order. Unlike his predecessor, who had preferred to delegate and command from a distance, Weygand thus gets on a plane to join his forces gathered in the north of France and in Belgium. This will allow him to take stock with the officers on the spot as well as the Allied commanders. But what plan does he actually arrive with? And how does he plan to get the Allied armies out of this situation? Initially, Weygand doubts the credibility of a massive re-embarkation and does not believe it. Into a sustainable bridgehead on the coast near Dunkirk. The only remaining option is a counterattack. Weygand's straightforward objective is to minimize the front's extent wherever possible, allowing a majority of French forces, and particularly the less battle-tested British, to spearhead the attack. However, this move requires the Belgian army to give up nearly all its national territory by retreating behind the Isère River, thus offering him a narrow front to defend while relying on the river. General van Overstraten, advisor to King Leopold III of Belgium, who leads the Belgian armies, believes the army is close to breaking and worries this movement could become a rout. Under German pressure, King Leopold III shares this analysis and does not wish to give up any more ground to the Germans. After initial hesitation, he grasps the situation and agrees. The Belgian army will support the plan. For the French, under Weygand, the situation is more precarious. The reality of the situation forces Weygand to simultaneously seek to sufficiently stabilize the front in the north, while the French army must find enough resources and men to form the strongest possible front. Further south, extending from the sea to the Maginot Line, this front line must protect Paris and, importantly, its industries. However, while aware of the precarious situation of the French forces, surrounded by the Germans in the north, he also believes that along with the British, they must attempt to break through southward to halt the German advance and potentially reverse the situation. However, Weygand's plan hinges on two factors he has little control over. On one hand, the Belgian movement must succeed, while on the other hand, the counteroffensive heavily depends on a committed engagement from the British Expeditionary Force. The British Expeditionary Force and its divisions are preferred over the French divisions to carry out the offensive, due to their relatively good state of freshness compared to other allies. In other words, if there is a counteroffensive, the shack is held by the Belgians and the French, while the attack is carried out by the British. But then, what positions do the British have on this matter? As of May 21st, it's unclear. General Gort clearly feels that things are going awry and rightly fears for the expeditionary force he is in charge of. He is still hesitating between two options: either reposition his forces to launch an offensive on the Somme, as Weygand wants, or retreat to the ports to re-embark the British expeditionary force. In order to convince him, both the French and Belgians commit to replacing several British divisions on the front line to allow them to reposition for the offensive. This will also allow them to maintain the state of readiness that is required for the operations expected of them. Without being entirely convinced, Gort eventually accepts the idea of a general repositioning of the Allies in order to allow a counter-offensive. However, the situation deteriorates hourly, and from May 23rd onward, Gort loses faith in it. Without consulting his government or the French and Belgians, he arranges the retreat of the BIF. He thus takes advantage of the repositioning of his allies in order to withdraw his pawns. Not to attack, but to unilaterally retreat to the sector's ports. From May 24th, the first British units begin their ground retreat, while Gort obtains May 25th the official order from his government to arrange for the embarkation of the maximum number of British troops possible. However, this movement doesn't mean the British suddenly leave the front or that all the men on the ground share Gort's position. In practice, several British generals and officers oppose this decision, deeming it morally questionable. But they are quickly called to order and fall in line with their leaders' orders, when the tactical situation in the sector becomes so degraded that the prospect of a counteroffensive seems only to recede. The British unilaterally abandon the counteroffensive, and Weygand only resumes it on May 26th. While the British approach is morally sound, their analysis is still understandable. On the ground, the chaos is major and the German pressure cracks the front at several points. Despite the French and Belgian soldiers' courage, the situation rapidly deteriorates. The Belgian army is on the brink of defeat due to ammunition shortages, while the Germans consistently outpace the French, as was notably the case in Lille, where 7 divisions find themselves trapped and will stand out for their extraordinary spirit of sacrifice, a subject that we had indeed discussed together previously. From their perspective, the issue is resolved, prompting them to minimize the harm, rather than risk losing the bulk of their strength in trying to restore a situation they no longer believe in. Thus, on May 26th, Weygand is forced to definitively abandon his counteroffensive. He then changes his plans, prioritizing forming a solid front on the Somme and Aisne. To do this, he needs as much time as possible to mass everything he has at hand there, while giving the men time to prepare their position. This is about setting up France's ultimate defense, the Weygand line. According to Weygand, the outlook for the French army is bleak. From the Swiss border to the sea, passing through the Maginot Line, Weygand can only count on 60 divisions, including the fortress divisions, which are ineffective in open field combat and thus stationed on the Maginot Line. The German army, in contrast, can muster around double that number. However, the German army is having a hard time in the north, the French army is fighting well there, and the British are doing their best to cover their own retreat movement. But the task is arduous. Weygand lacks the troops needed to form a solid front over the given distance, even as the Wehrmacht already has several bridgeheads, notably in Abbeville and Péronne. On the French side, as of May 26th, the morale of the troops, as well as a large part of the commanders, remains overall rather fragile and fluctuating. Weygand's situation is exacerbated by inadequate support from politicians, many of whom already feel defeated. Despite the worsened situation, he must restore everyone's faith. Weygand is fully aware of the situation and in private is not exactly optimistic. He knows that in reality it is unlikely that a miracle will happen. However, he is a soldier of integrity who does not admit defeat readily. He does what's needed to restore hope whenever possible, to restore order and discipline where it has been lacking, and of course to establish the best defense possible with limited resources. Several hypotheses are being studied regarding the continuation of the campaign. Paul Reynaud, the French Council President, suggests retreating to Brittany, while others consider repositioning on the Loire. However, Weygand rejects these hypotheses for 2 reasons. Firstly, the French army lacks the mobility to successfully carry out its operations. The fall of the Paris region would strip France of most of its industry, rendering it unable to fight for long. The commander-in-chief likely believes France's future will be determined on the Abbeville-Montmédy axis. He establishes a final defense line, later known as the Weygand Line. A tactical point must be made here. Weygand knows that speed and mobility are key strengths of the German army, while the French army lacks these qualities. The latter, however, and in particular its infantry, has shown remarkable tenacity and resilience, causing serious difficulties for the German army, even when the divisions were surrounded. After consulting May battle veterans, Weygand devised the hedgehog tactic to counter German mobile warfare. This has several variants, but is related to the Weygand Line. Position infantry in a checkerboard pattern, with artillery support forming autonomous, organized, and solid islands, relying on the terrain, whether it be forests, reliefs, or villages, for example. This deep defense encourages the adversary to slip into the gaps presented by the device, thus allowing to strike its units from three sides. Destroying a hedgehog is costly and time-consuming for the attacker. Moreover, if the checkerboard is pierced, the enemy can hardly establish a permanent foothold behind enemy lines. As long as some hedgehogs remain, they disrupt the establishment of permanent logistical lines. It's a well-executed response to the German army's strength in May and an intelligent use of French resources. By slowing the German army's movements, Weygand undermines the doctrine of war of movement that the Wehrmacht relies on. But there is a caveat. For this tactic's long-term success, the defender must have reserve units to counterattack the enemy, getting behind their lines. Without this, hedgehogs allow time to be gained, but only need to be isolated, besieged, and exhausted to be defeated. In detail, Weygand is attempting to put this into practice. Initially, no less than 37 French divisions were repositioned within 2 weeks to form this front and its hedgehogs. On June 4th, the Weygand Line consists of 43 divisions spanning 360 kilometers from Abbeville to Montmédy, to which are added the 17 fortress divisions positioned on the Maginot Line. The remaining armored and motorized forces, though significantly reduced, are reorganized to be concentrated within 3 groups held back and whose role will be to counterattack the enemy units passing through the hedgehogs. But this is where one of the great vulnerabilities of the plan lies, linked to the situation that the Generalissimo found. These groups won't fully form on the ground until June 15th. Meanwhile, a total of 600 armored vehicles from tank battalions are positioned to provide a counterattack capability, albeit limited and short-lived. The French army must hold out without yielding until June 15th to have hope of prevailing. Historian Chievon states that the Germans amassed 80 divisions against the French, while German historian Frieser puts the number at 104. The force includes 10 panzer divisions with over 10,100 tanks, more than triple the number of armored vehicles fielded by the French. The German Vollrot, or Red Plan, consists of 2 pushes, one towards Normandy, aiming for the Seine, and another in Champagne a few days later, with the objective of the Swiss border, allowing to trap the French units arranged on the Maginot Line. On the evening of June 4th, the French prepared to fight at a disadvantage of 1 against 2 or 3 with inferior resources. Since about 3/4 of the modern French equipment was then lost during the fights in May, all this was done without reserve or any possibility of effective air support. But they have hope. If they hold out until June 15th, the reconstitution of stronger reserves in their rear can change the course of the battle in history. This is how the moment of truth arrives when the sun rises on June 5th. On the morning of June 5th, 1940, France stands alone to face its destiny. The situation is unbalanced, but the French armed forces effectively absorb a shock they were prepared for this time. The French morale is good, despite a strong German advance across the entire front, especially near Abbeville and Amiens. resistance remains intense. The Germans are suffering heavy losses and failing to advance. A prime example is the confrontation between the powerful German 14th Panzer Corps and two simple French infantry divisions. During the attack, the German 14th Armored Corps consists of two panzer divisions, armored divisions, composed of about 200 tanks each, a motorized infantry division, a foot infantry division, and the famous elite regiment. Grossdeutschland consisted of 430 tanks and 64,000 men. The 16th and 24th French infantry divisions, each with 18,000 well-trained and motivated men, face them. While the 2nd has been severely tested by the fighting in previous weeks and had to fill the gaps in its ranks with the men it could get its hands on, each lacks equipment and artillery but adapts their defensive arrangements to the recovered equipment, making the best of the situation. Additionally, around 30 light tanks highly effective against infantry are held in reserve in the sector. In short, the balance of power heavily favors the Germans. Despite intense bombardment from German artillery and several waves of aerial bombings, the French hedgehogs hold firm. Losses are limited, defenses are in excellent shape, and morale remains high. When the German tanks are launched against these positions, following this first attempt to crush on June 5th, they are brutally stopped in their progression. The hedgehogs work wonders and hold them in check. The 14th Panzer Corps. The German Armored Corps, backed by elite infantry, is defeated by French infantry and artillery. For several days, the fighting is brutal, and the Germans persist until June 10th, where the fate of this battle turns. Do you think the French will be overwhelmed in this confrontation? No, it ends with a French victory. General Fedor von Bock, commanding the German right wing, orders the retreat of the badly weakened 14th Panzer Corps, unable to continue its offensive, before attaching its remnants to the 16th Panzer Corps further east. Through the hedgehog tactic, the audacity of the French and their courage, two very classic French infantry divisions, managed to overcome a German armored offensive. However, this is achieved at a horrific cost. By June 10th, over 25,000 German infantrymen are out of combat in this sector. This includes those killed, missing, seriously wounded, and briefly incapacitated. Nearly 200 German tanks are permanently lost. On the French side, it's a Pyrrhic victory, with 60–70% of the engaged forces lost in these battles. On the evening of June 10, 1942, victorious but severely weakened infantry divisions held their position without reserves. The situation is similar everywhere else. Despite strong German pressure and extreme imbalance of forces in some sectors, no failures are to be noted. On the 5th and 6th of June, the French soldiers, as well as the troops from the colonial empire, cling to their position with incredible tenacity, which makes General Frere say, during an exchange with his counterpart, General Besson, "Everyone is holding on at my end. We are surrounded but persevering. I'm absolutely convinced the French army is saving itself." The first 2 days of combat go well for the French, who regain hope due to various successes across the entire front. However, from June 7th, the left wing of the device, where most of the German effort was focused for 2 days, became somewhat destabilized. While Amiens holds slightly more to the northwest, the situation is tough, particularly under the inclusion of the famous German general Erwin Rommel. A brilliant and daring tank commander, he effectively uses the terrain to approach French artillery positions under cover, which he then dislodges forcefully during brutal skirmishes. Once done, the infantry is vulnerable. And despite numerous acts of individual bravery, such as that exemplified by the Senegalese infantry, who did not hesitate to climb onto enemy tanks to find a weakness, the infantry no longer have the firepower to prevail. However, heavy German losses force them to be more cautious than in May. Overall, the pace of German operations is slowing down, while the Weygand line, including in this sector, maintains its coherence and does not collapse. But despite this, the next day, After 3 days of brutal determination, it is once again Rommel who destabilizes the French device when he manages to lead his tanks to the banks of the Seine. The French are in a dire situation as their sector has been breached. What's left now comes into play: light mechanical divisions and French armored divisions, which cover, as best they can, the disengagement of several infantry divisions so that they can try to reposition further south on the Seine, while several infantry divisions move up from Paris in an attempt to fill the gaps. The French army is shaken but holds firm. It is then only a week away from defeat. On June 9, 1940, German General von Rundstedt launched a major offensive in Champagne with 4 powerfully equipped panzer divisions leading the charge. To the Germans' astonishment, the French army, much like its left wing, fully withstands the initial assault. Despite a significant disadvantage, the panzers are again halted completely. This is the case, for example, in the Rethel sector, where the 14th Infantry Division is commanded by General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny. It is indeed de Lattre you are thinking of, who firmly holds his positions and captures 2,000 prisoners on the first day of combat. Losses are equally devastating across the entire front. On June 9th alone, 2,600 French soldiers fall for their country. On the left, things remain dire. The first German tanks to breach the lines have reached Rouen. This destabilizes a device that depends primarily on infantry on foot struggling to redeploy. But the matter is far from settled. If the Weygand line holds in Champagne, the critical situation in Normandy can still be addressed. However, if the device is also breached there, the army would lose cohesion and the battle would be lost with no chance of recovery. Thus, June 10th is the decisive day. Both sides suffer terrible losses throughout the day, but the French cannot replace theirs. As a result, units are struggling to maintain control of their positions. The battle's attrition and the German forces' concentration in Champagne, eventually, the Weygand line dam cracked and finally burst the following day. Despite fighting with limited reserves just 4 days after the defeat, the French army faces a strategic defeat. Simply so you can understand what we're talking about when we mention fights that are hard and violent. In a week of combat, it's an average of 2,000 French soldiers who lose their lives each day. The number of deaths greatly exceeds those in World War I or the Battle of Verdun, which averaged 600 deaths daily. On the French side, on the German side, the losses are also terrible. The Wehrmacht lost 21,000 men in May. It counts 28,000 dead and missing in its ranks in June, roughly 1,650 dead or missing per day of combat. The battles of this decisive period are therefore brutal and the losses absolutely terrible on both sides, illustrating both the harshness of the battles and the determination of a diminished French army, but refusing defeat and clinging to its positions at all costs. By the evening of June 12th, out of the 43 French divisions initially engaged in the sector, 13 were destroyed. 19 Namaskos and about a quarter of their initial forces remain, while only around 10 divisions have half their original strength. The tactic worked perfectly and the dam held as long as physically possible. But the successive German onslaughts, whose army was able to replace its losses, gradually allowed to physically crack a French defense that, morally and tactically, had not given in. The fighting doesn't stop instantly, but as of June 11th, everyone acknowledges the battle is militarily lost. Without diplomatic and political decisions, French military command chooses to gradually withdraw armies to the southeast in order to rely on the Rhone and to join up with the Army of the Alps, which is then holding the Italian army at bay. The aim is to minimize losses until a political and diplomatic resolution is reached, while trying to extract as many men as possible from the various masses and encirclements currently forming. Paris can no longer be realistically defended. Declared an open city, the Germans enter on June 14th. Despite these efforts and decisions, many French units are destroyed or captured. Several pockets of resistance form, the largest containing 500,000 men trapped in Lorraine. However, on June 17, 1940, the Germans definitively won the Battle of France, while fighting continued locally until the armistice was signed, June 22, 1940. These historical events illustrate the French Army's ability to face adversity in 1940. Officers and soldiers from all backgrounds showed remarkable tenacity and ingenuity in a situation where many others would have given up. But the solution came after a bitter and costly failure in manpower, time, and material. Weygand's reorganization and his objectively brilliant plan needed a stroke of luck that never came. Once that's been said, it's also important to keep in mind that behind these facts and shared figures hide as many individual stories and family dramas embodied by husbands, sons, and brothers within both camps, who never returned and gave their lives for their country. I dedicate this work to these men and their comrades who participated in and survived the battle. If you think my work deserves it, give this video a thumbs up and share your feedback in the comments. I would also be very pleased to see you again for other documentaries of this type, so subscribe. In May 1940, the French Army attempted to close the massive gap created by the German breakthrough at Sedan. No, well, the next video is made for you.